is the gateway to a new world. Welcome to the Masterclass of the Hidden Monks.
What we need to do is his pre-show.
So Paul, am I?
Coming in with the camera.
Yep, so we have 14 minutes.
He's not ready.
He's fine. He's not going to distract me.
Yeah, let's just go with it and see what happens. All right.
You're just running at the same time?
Yeah, Nick, let me know when you're ready.
I'm ready whenever you guys are.
Just explain to them,
How's the
sorry
audio?
for the little technical difficulties. How's the audio?
Yep.
Audio's good.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
I'm getting lag. Bad lag. Really bad lag.
Thank you. Right there. Keep
All
him
right.
there. Okay, keep him right
And it's not
Keep the
showing
energy
up
in.
here. What do you want me to do?
Okay, what I want you to do is, since we have just a complete lag, right? And there isn't anything that we can end up doing to
It's
bypass
catching up.
catching up.
I don't know about that. But it's
Okay, let's
catching
go
up.
ahead and hit him up.
Just
Just
go
hit him
live
up.
on them?
Go live.
Alright.
Get ready at 3,
Ready,
2.
Nick?
Let me go 3, 2, and you're going to end up saying welcome with a lot of energy. All right? We're happening. Welcome to the masterclass. We don't know if they've heard that, okay? 3, 2, 1, live.
Welcome to the Masters Class. This is Nick Begich, and I know we've had a little technical difficulties this morning, but we're going to get this rolling right along, and we have a lot to cover today. The Hidden Monks. You're the Hidden Monks. We're all the Hidden Monks, and really that's where the story begins. And a lot of big changes for me have been coming in the last few months, and I don't have a script, but boy, do I have a lot of notes that we're going to get through today, and we have a long day in front of us. But first, I want to give my formal introduction. It's Nicholas John Begich, and I'm the eldest son of Peggy and Nicholas Begich. I was born here in Alaska. My name means Nicholas Victorious Army, John by the grace of God. I have 2 other names. I was adopted twice Athabascan. My Wade gave me the name Kuska, which means chief or leader. My sister Danita Peter Clausen gave me the name Nabuquinishin, which means the one who speaks up for us. The 2 villages that my name is represented by is Chicaloon and Tyonik. And these are villages within the Cook Inlet region, which is where we are today, here in Anchorage, Alaska. The Hidden Monks is really all about you. It's about us, about what we do in the world and whether or not we're going to just continue in kind of this pattern that we've been in for an awful long time, or whether we're going to reset. And I've had my own personal big reset lately. And one of the issues that really settled in me was this concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And really whether any of us are really having that these days. And you know, when I think about my friends, yeah, sure, there's a few, maybe. But the amount of anxiety, stress, the things happening in the world today, really have pressed down on us in a way that probably hasn't been ever. When you look around the world, the typeset, sort of the cultural context in which everything's been shut down, and things have happened gradually. I travel a lot. I've traveled all over the world. So we're going to get into a lot of issues, but I want to also thank the team that tried to put all this together, and it is a team effort. We've had a lot of volunteers. I've had some professionals, and we're working in a real short timeline to cover an awful lot of material, and I just appreciate that. You know, the last 50 years has been scholarship from the time I was 12, and we're going to get into all of that. But we've had that little bit of an introduction to my family, and I know we've had a few stops and starts there, so I don't know what all got covered. But I want to give a little background on the family history, my personal history, as a starting point today to really begin to sort of open up who is this guy that's talking, and where does he come from in terms of background? Because I've lived a very different life. But let me talk about my dad a little bit. My dad came here. He was pretty young, in his early 20s, a teacher, a principal. He had all of those attributes. But the big things he did in legislation here, at the very beginning, just after statehood, all of the education legislation, the things that set in motion what schools would look like, how they'd be funded, the first public kindergarten, the first special ed classes, rural health, the first big initiatives in rural health, and what was going on in Alaska in the 1950s and early 1960s. The average age of a Native American, 40 years old, maybe a little older, maybe a little younger. People had seen a lot of death no matter where you lived in Alaska. And my dad flew everywhere. He flew to every single village virtually in this state at one point or another. And it was always the same. It was always the same. And he grew up poor. He knew what poor was, but even he had never seen what was happening in rural Alaska in the early 1960s. Appalachia was an improvement for what was happening here. And a lot of people don't know it, but even to this day, 2021, we still have 30 of our villages don't have running water. They don't have sewer. They're still hauling their septic in buckets to lagoons. But we're building toilets all around the world with your tax dollars, but not here. The things Dad did, education, as I said, was a big thing. Collective bargaining, retirement systems for public employees, all that was his legislation. And he was known as Mr. Education because that was his background, and that was where he felt things could really change. In rural Alaska, there had been lawsuits right around that time to create an equalization in education. So they had to figure out a way to do this. You know, how are you going to deliver education when you don't have roads, you don't have anything, you don't have any infrastructure. And that's where we were, and that's where I was growing up in Anchorage. Native land claims, when he made it to Congress, that was his big thing. In the first year, he passed the largest native land claim settlement in the history of the United States. In the first year, in a Congress where Alaska has one representative. Yeah, we're a big state, but in Congress it's all about population, and we have the smallest population of any state. So consequently, he had to do the work, convince 435 of his colleagues that some things were good ideas. Native land claims was one of them. We'll talk more about that later. The Marine Mammal Protection Act that many people remember, that was his legislation with the exemptions for Alaska Natives to be able to deal with marine mammals in the manner in which they had for thousands of years. And you'll see art around my house as we go through the day of some of that. The other oil pipeline had to get done here. You know, that was a big thing back then. In order for it to get done, they had to settle the titles, the land titles, and ours weren't settled here. The state hadn't finished its selections, the native land claims hadn't been done. Really not much had been done here, and we'll get more into that later. He also got an amendment to the Jones Act for a vessel in Alaska. I don't believe anyone ever has since or before. We'll talk more about why that's important. And the other thing was the Clean Water Act, which also had certain exemptions for Alaska. All that happened in 71, 72 in my dad's first year in Congress, and that was when Earth Day happened, was right around the same time. A lot was going on in D.C. Back then. You know, when you think about the early 70s, we got there in 1970. And just to kind of give the backdrop, because it was similar to the backdrop of 2020 and 2021. You know, we had a lot of unrest. We had the end of the Vietnam War. We had impeachment of Nixon being talked about. Watergate hadn't quite broke, but right after the election, it certainly did. The second election of Richard Nixon. The protests back then were wild. You know, 9,000 people were arrested and put in JFK Stadium, not a few hundred, 9,000, because they were 100,000 were marching down the other way on Pennsylvania Avenue during the inaugural parade. People don't remember it, but I do, because I was there. You know, I was pretty young, but I remember it. You know, when I think about what else happened, China opened up, the gold window closed, we had the oil shortage. If you remember, some will remember, we had inflation double digit, and we had mortgage rates jumping up to 12 and 14%, believe it or not. All of that history, again, the backdrop of where we were. The CIA, the FBI had their chops beaten in by the church committee. Many will remember that. Again, history was happening, a lot of things, violations of our security agencies against American people was going on, same as now. Warren Commission, Kennedy's investigation, all being thought about again at that time, because there were some things people thought hadn't been done right. Congress had been violated by the FBI, everybody tapped, their mail infiltrated. Hale Boggs was the Speaker of the House at the time. The majority leader at the time, and headed for the speaker position. When I think about all those guys and where were they at right then, was at a real critical crossroads where things could have been way different. And instead they went a much different way. And we'll get into that as we get into the day. My mom, she went on, she did a lot of things after my dad disappeared. He was lost on a plane in 1972. Just before the election, the second election of Richard Nixon. He was lost with Hale Boggs, the majority leader at the time. Powerful people disappeared on a small plane flying from Anchorage to Juneau, and not a trace officially ever found. And we'll get into that perhaps a little bit later too. But my mom, as National Committee woman, later a couple times, ran even a couple times for my dad's seat. Never did make that, but stayed active in the party up until the early 90s, when press reports came out that perhaps my dad's plane had been located and just never recovered. That was pretty disturbing. Mom left Alaska. She gave up politics. The rest of us stayed in it. And my brother Mark at the time had been a number of times. He had served 3 terms. Twice he had served, as time went on, as mayor of Anchorage, and eventually United States Senator from Alaska, now involved in business here. My brother Tom, he ran probably 100 campaigns for other people, worked in a bunch of different places. He was organizing juvenile justice for 9 different states all the way, including Guam, and worked for the Department of Justice, organizing juvenile justice courts and kind of ways to deal with young people. He worked 5 years in the indigenous world here also. He also worked 5 years for IBW as a pollster and involved in a lot of their work. But Tom now is in the state senate representing downtown Anchorage. In fact, he had the easiest election of any Begich. The first time he ran, he had an opposition in the primary and went on to win. And the second time he ran, nobody bothered to run against him at all. And so Tom knows what he's doing. People like him, and he does a good job in Juneau. My sisters, Nichelle and Stephanie, both went into education, followed my dad's work there. Nichelle became a principal, 2 different schools. She dealt with the toughest kids around, and before that, she dealt with pregnant teens for 25 years within the context of the school system. She had 2 degrees, a master's, eventually 2 degrees, a master's in social work and a master's in education. She also managed a school at the prison here for kids between 16 and 26 that didn't make it and kids that dropped out, and probably helped several thousand people in her career. My sister Stephanie started elementary school teacher, went up, became a teacher expert, training other teachers how to teach and deliver a decent educational product. My brother Paul the youngest of all. He had a career in retail, has done a lot there. He's a very creative person. Set up a bunch of stores for my sister-in-law at the airport, and did a lot of work for Nordstrom's over a 20-year career with them. And that's my family, you know, and when you think about it, and my dad, I think about my dad and the people around us and what I was doing as a little kid. As a little kid, where you would find me and my brothers was hiding behind the couch, and that was kind of a phrase, hiding behind the couch. We were listening to all of these conversations. You know, in the early days, it was teachers and educators and political people when a state was being formed. And later it was Carl Elbert, the Speaker of the House, Hubert Humphrey, because he was a friend of my dad's from when my dad was a teenager and worked on his very first campaigns in Minnesota. You know, all these people were around us, and we were listening, and we were paying attention, and the world was being shaped in a way that is very different. You know, growing up, for me, I heard phrases like from people recently that kind of surprised me. I was in a conversation just less than a year ago with someone really close to me, and they said, well, we can't do anything about that. And it was in the context of some big issue in the world, and I thought to myself, well, I can, and so can you. And that's the point. When I grew up, I didn't think that you couldn't. And really until like that moment, I really didn't think much about it. It was like an assumption, like breathing. You know, if you breathe, you don't really talk about it much, unless maybe you live in Beijing and you're choking on air. That's not good for you. But short of that, certain assumptions that we all make, actually, we may go a very long time. I'm 62 years old. We may go a very long time before we say, oh, wow, that was an assumption, not real. It was a belief, it wasn't real. Stop and think about it, even in the context of the simplest things. But I want to talk about when things really changed for me, because as a teenager growing up, and as a young person, and my mom would tell you, you know, when Dad disappeared, he was just 40, and Mom was 34 with 6 kids. And not the simplest of kids, as you can tell by our sort of snapshot resumes. We were pretty independent in every single that. The same things that make a kid independent thinking and creative thinking will either lead them to leadership with the right mentoring, or you'll be a master criminal, you know, because creativity happens, you know, and kids, I saw so many kids I knew that had all the potential that my brothers and sisters and I had, but just a different circumstance within their family configuration. But they just didn't know they could do anything, so they didn't. They just didn't know they had possibilities, so they didn't. They just didn't know that there were things possible. And when it dawned on me, the first big shock, you know, my dad and I had a lot of clashes, pretty rebellious kid, because I really was independent. When he disappeared, it was a different thing. It wasn't like a death and a funeral. It was just gone. So for me, that was like my big reset. As a teenager, I was at 14 at the time. And for me, you know, without a conclusion, it made me just kind of rethink everything. And I'm a C/D student to straight A's. Not because I was a genius, it was because I was more perseverant. I decided something different. And so Dad, what he couldn't do for me alive, you know, the one thing he really wanted me to do is take it all more seriously, he got that. And I say this in this sense. For me, it represents both tragedy and at the same time, transformation. And I want to be careful about that, because death is that. And what I observed then as a young person was that around me, people were definitely falling apart in lots of different ways, because nobody had any certainty. But I think about afterwards, their time goes on and you kind of figure that it's not going to sort out the way you planned it. About 30% of people never kind of got over it, and about 70% did. So arbitrarily, that was kind of my number in my head as a 14-year-old was, you can do this now or you can do this later, but whatever trauma you're in, you can use it as your time for reconsideration and transformation. And that's what I did. And I did. And my mom cried about it because I said, look, I'm done being a child. I'm not doing that anymore. And she knew I meant it. She told me recently, she cried about it. But I was serious about it. And so, and I always had certain interests young. I was involved in business really young. And I took things seriously. In fact, one of the first books I read, I'll pull off the shelf for a second, because it did make a difference to me. And it made a big difference to me in the context of just looking at sort of how life went. And this book, Think and Grow Rich, I read it when I was 12, and some people that were Amway dealers, and everybody who did Amway knows about it. I was 12 years old, but they saw something in me that was really unique and different. And then I read that book, and I thought, well, they were pretty serious about it, you know, and this is a couple years before my dad passed away. I was 12, I didn't understand the vocabulary, so I read it again, only this time, every time I didn't understand a word, I looked it up. So that took a little longer. And then I read the book again, because now I understood the vocabulary. And then I wrote the book. You know, I wrote 36 pages at 12 of my own words writing that book. And why did I do that? Well, I decided to be successful, not the rich part, but it was really about being successful. And I went on to read his other two books, which I don't think the Amway people read. And one was called Laws of Success. It was a big, thick book. And it was really good. And then the other one was called Grow Rich with Peace of Mind, which was a little thin book again, but I don't think the Amway dealers were reading that one either, because about midway through it, Napoleon Hill, the writer, has this little spiritual encounter that kind of, I don't think the Amway dealers had read that one. But I just say that to be a little bit funny, because what was there was a lot of ideas about a way of being, a way of thinking, that this guy from the 30s and 40s and 50s, when he was doing his work, had pointed out. And as a 12-year-old, it made sense to me. One of the principles he had was mastermind. I'm going to get into that later, because I used it all my life. I still use it to this day. And a lot of other principles that are there that I'm going to get into later in the discussion. My life as a kid was traveling around with my mom, because she'd throw all of us in the back of a station wagon and leave Alaska and travel all around the country. And we learned a lot that way. Imagine 6 kids in the back of a station wagon, if you're driving around, what that might have been like for a couple of months. But it taught us a lot about a lot. You know, if you stop and think about getting along, about the things you see and what you learn in communicating with a lot of people. And so it was really a good thing. But again, I took life pretty seriously. At 16, I was married my first time. I was married 10 years. A lot of people don't know that aspect of me. I had my first child, Nicholas, when I was 19, a few years later. And I graduated high school early. I jammed it in a little faster and did a lot of other things. I opened a jewelry store when I was 14. I had it for a couple years, into 16, and then I kept it until I graduated high school at 17, and then I went to work on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, which was a whole nother deal, you know, and I did that. I wanted to be a part of that. You know, I had the jewelry business when I was doing the pipeline thing. And I worked in some wild places, a lot of people. Imagine being 17, showing up in a camp with 1,200 men and 10 women, and then your first day on the job is you go in and you see the guys and you weigh 120 pounds and you're wearing enough clothing so you look like you weigh about 240, and they say, hey, we're going to work down at the heliport. And you think, oh, I'm a fuel handler, I'm going to fuel helicopters. Nope, that was the way I was going to work, because I got dropped off on the fourth deepest construction grade in U.S. history at the time with 5-gallon buckets, a helicopter dropping 450-gallon tanks, and I was fueling fuel on Thompson Pass during the pipeline for that very end of it. And then I was up north doing a little bit with some hydro testing crews up there until just before the oil started flowing. In fact, over here on the shelf, in fact, I'll go to it because it's kind of interesting as I walk through the resume, because it's also part of the history of the state. You know, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline at its peak produced 2 million barrels of oil a day. 2 million barrels of oil a day, tremendous amount. This is from the Manhattan. This was the icebreaker. It was the icebreaker that first went up there and got a barrel of oil off of the North Slope, and this was given to my dad when he was in the Congress. And so I still have it. That's my belt buckle from Associated Green, the company I worked for up north when I was working at a place called Franklin Bluffs, where they discovered oil recently, by the way, and gas. And back here are my dispatches. I actually have them, my dispatches from my Teamster call and my A card from the Teamsters Union that I was in at the time. You know, I keep it all. It's like part of my history. And I've always kept my history close, because to me, a lot of people don't even have that possibility. And the fact that they haven't even kept track of it. So young, I'm doing things. My interests were gemology and minerals and business that was associated with that. And so the jewelry store gave me that kind of outlet. But I was real curious, and the people I hung around with were all older than me. They were between like usually 40 and 70, so I've lost a lot of people in this lifetime. But at the time, my mentors were saying, go to the Gemological Institute, study there, you know, because they really can help you. And they had an independent study. I did it through them. And then that's really where my interest in the sciences took off, because earth sciences were the beginning of it. But I also learned a few things. I apprenticed as a silversmith, so I can do that too. And again, you know, growing up, I had a lot of different experiences, but the physics became interesting when I studied gemology, because I was studying crystals, crystallography, the physics of light as it relates to that. All of that became very interesting to me, and as I walk through today, we'll get back into some of that science and what it simulated even that far back. But science wasn't easy. None of it was easy. And what I learned, one of the tricks I learned, and it's a good key for everyone, is if you want to learn a new subject, start with the language of the subject. Start with the back of the book, the glossary, and just read it and study that. Because if you have the language of the science, or the language of the economics, or the language of whatever it is you're studying, you'll have 90% of it just in the words. And so that's important as you're building knowledge. Think about the words that build that knowledge. Because that's what I've done all my life. Think about it. And then I figured out why I did that. I didn't figure out until late in high school that I'm dyslexic. So I read things and flip them around. So you have to drill down deeper if you have that. And I'm glad no one discovered it earlier. They would have given me some kind of a handicap title that would have slowed me down, I'm sure. Instead, they figured it out late, great, and I didn't let it bother me too much, but it did have an effect on my learning. I'll tell you where it showed up. All my test scores off the charts all the time, you know, especially reading, comprehension, understanding things, sourcing things. But spelling, I graduated high school spelling at 5th grade, and I graduated honors 19 out of 485, a year early than a year ahead of everyone else, because I had to do more classes, and I was married my last 2 years and running a jewelry store and work. So yeah, you can do it if you're perseverant and you don't sleep much. And it makes people nervous when I do that these days, because I can. But again, I was gaining knowledge, and I love knowledge. If I could have stayed in school my whole life, I would have. And what I wanted to do, really, if I think back on it, if I could have chosen, I would have been a scholar. And what I realize now after all these years, I was, because I always read 40 or 50 hours a week. And my favorite picture, I think they showed in the pre-shots, were me sitting on a pile of books, reading books at 2 years old, or at least flipping through them. And that's who I've been, you know, when I think back on all the stuff I've read. The library next to me that we'd be going through is maybe 1,000 volumes between this one and the one in the back. And out of that, that's like 10% of what I've read in books. And I've read maybe 100,000 in different articles, scientific articles and others, and just I read all the time. And then I have conversation with a lot of interesting people, from legislators and political people, business leaders, you know, PhDs in any number of sciences, Nobel Prize winners. I mean, I travel a lot, I meet a lot of people, and I maintain relationship, because that's what really life is more about. but leaving the pipeline work and the trades work, kind of at the end of that, I'd been reading a lot. I read a lot in the sciences at the time, and I started reading in the parasciences, parapsychology, a lot of that then. Got very interested in that. Probably read 1,000 volumes in religion, occult, parascience, physics, chemistry at the time. And got pretty excited. And then I was hanging out with some friends in Florida. I met somebody down there that owned a very large company. They got me involved in, wanted to get me involved in this thing called the International Biorhythm Research Association. And I ended up showing up at 19 years old for a meeting. I won't go into the long story on it, but I ended up showing up for a week-long meeting, and my job there was to make a little presentation, and then at the same time, or present a paper is what they call it, right? It's what we make it straight for science. You got to present a paper is how they do it. So my paper was on contrasting the way the former Soviet Union at the time and the United States pursued research, because within the context of military research, advanced research in the United States at the time, we used compartmentalization. You know, we kind of split everything up into the smallest little bite so no one would ever see what the other guy was doing. And so a lot of times we'd duplicate things. I mean, very inefficient when you do it that way, and I knew that at 19, although the rest of the government was doing something different. I wasn't in the government at the time. I was kind of watching it from having been in the inside, but now watching from the outside a bit. But the other thing, when I think about the U.S. side being so inefficient, the Russians did it so different, the Soviets. What they did is integrate science. They took all these people from all these very different areas and put them all together. And think about it. How did they keep up with the science? They didn't have the productive capacity. They could barely build anything over there. My mom was there in a diplomatic passport in '71. I remember the conversations coming back. And hey, it was amazing that they could do a lot of things at that time, because the productive capacity was limited, but the scientific knowledge and the intellect and how that had been configured, I thought that looked way ahead of us, because they were developing science in some really interesting ways. So that was my presentation. One of the things I had read at the time was Ostrander and Schroeder's work, which they had just completed, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, which was an analysis of what was going on in all of Eastern Europe from the inside, relative to a whole bunch of areas of science. And things were pretty exciting. Eyeless sight, the idea blind people could move their hands across paper like this and distinguish letters, color, all of that. And so when I think about that particular time, Ibra wanted me to look at what was going on within this configuration of scientists. Did anyone there have something that could be commercialized? And the company behind that was International Horizons Corporation in Atlanta. And they'd been involved in selling first encyclopedias in Japan, later language tools for learning English for Japanese children. Very successful company, doing about $100 million a year in sales. After that, they got into the biorhythm research, which is these three physical rhythms that the body is associated with. And so they built the first computer calculator that did those calculations. And then they brought all these experts together from all over the world, and that was this conference that I was at. So the guy